The Wyoming Territory, winter of 1847. Snow cuts through the mountain air like frozen daggers as Samuel Cartwright stumbles toward the abandoned cabin, his horse dead 2 miles back, frostbite claiming his fingers. The storm came from nowhere, trapping him between peaks with only darkness and death for company. But inside that cabin, by the dying embers of a fire, stands a man Samuel knows better than his own reflection. His father, Josiah Cartwright. The same weathered hands, the same piercing blue eyes, the same scar running down his left cheek from that grisly attack in 42. The problem? Samuel buried Josiah 3 years ago outside Independence, Missouri, watched the dirt cover his coffin, said the prayers himself. Now Josiah turns, smiles that familiar crooked smile, and says, "Hello, son. I've been waiting." Samuel's blood turns to ice water, because if his father is here, alive and unchanged by time, then what exactly did Samuel bury back in Missouri? And why does Josiah's shadow seem to move independently in the flickering firelight? What price did Josiah pay to return from the dead? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel's legs buckle, sending him crashing against the doorframe. The wooden planks groan under his weight, but the sound feels distant, muffled by the roaring in his ears. His father, or whatever wears his father's face, remains perfectly still, watching with those two familiar eyes. "You're dead." The words scrape from Samuel's throat like gravel. "I held your hand when you passed. The consumption took you." Josiah chuckles, the sound exactly as Samuel remembers, warm, deep, tinged with the authority that had guided their family through countless hardships. "Death ain't always the end, boy. Sometimes it's just a different kind of beginning." The cabin's interior flickers in and out of focus as Samuel's vision blurs. Exhaustion, cold, and shock wage war in his body. He notices details that shouldn't be possible. The fire burns without consuming the logs, casting light that seems to bend at impossible angles. Frost patterns on the windows form shapes that hurt to look at directly. How? Samuel forces himself upright, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. The metal feels warm despite the bitter cold, a small comfort in this nightmare. "Wrong question, son." Josiah steps closer, and Samuel catches something else, no breath missed in the frigid air. Better to ask why. Why I came back, why I've been waiting in this godforsaken place, watching the storms roll in, counting the days until you'd come seeking shelter. The wind howls outside, rattling the cabin's walls. Samuel realizes the blizzard isn't random. It drove him here with surgical precision, cutting off every other route through the mountains, as if the storm itself had purpose. "The Saints need you in Utah Territory," Samuel says, grasping for normalcy. "Brother Brigham's waiting. I can't. I won't be delayed by phantoms." "Phantoms?" Josiah's expression darkens. "Is that what you think I am? After everything we've been through? After I raised you to be the man standing before me?" Memory floods back unbidden, his father teaching him to read from the Book of Mormon by candlelight, showing him how to track game through Missouri woods, holding him when nightmares came. The same hands, the same voice, the same presence that had been Samuel's anchor in an uncertain world. But dead men don't speak. Dead men don't build fires or wait in abandoned cabins. "Prove you're really him," Samuel challenges, though his voice wavers. "Tell me something only my father would know." Josiah's smile turns sad. "You were 7 when your mother passed. Fever took her fast, and you blamed yourself for picking those berries that made her sick. I found you in the barn that night, trying to hang yourself with a rope you could barely tie. I cut you down and told you something I'd never shared with another living soul." Samuel's heart stops. The memory burns bright and terrible. His father's arms around him, whispering words meant only for them. "I told you about the night I almost didn't marry your mother. Got scared, thought I wasn't good enough for her. Ran halfway to Arkansas before I came to my senses. I told you that running from pain only makes it follow you farther. The words hit like physical blows. No one else knew that story. Samuel had never spoken of that night to anyone, not even his wife Rebecca. "Father?" The word comes out broken, desperate. Josiah nods, and for a moment the impossible situation almost makes sense, almost feels like a miracle instead of a curse. Then Samuel notices the smell, not the familiar scent of his father's tobacco and leather, but something else underneath, something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in standing water. Outside, the storm suddenly stops. The silence that follows feels heavier than the wind. The wind screamed against the cabin walls like something alive and hungry. Ezra stood frozen in the doorway, snow swirling around his boots, his rifle trembling in numb fingers. The man at the table, his father, hadn't moved, hadn't even looked up from whatever he was carving, with that familiar bone-handled knife. "Close the door, boy," came the voice that had haunted Ezra's dreams for 3 years. "You're letting the cold in." The words broke Ezra's paralysis. He stumbled backward into the storm, gasping as the wind drove ice crystals into his face like needles. This couldn't be real. He'd buried Samuel Thorne himself, had thrown dirt on that pine coffin with his own hands, had spoken the words over the grave while his mother wept beside him. But that voice, Lord help him, he knew that voice better than his own. The blizzard pushed against him with supernatural force, driving him back toward the cabin. Through the frosted window, he could see the figure still seated at the table, patient as stone. Ezra's horse whinnied in distress somewhere behind him, already half buried in the mounting drifts. He had no choice. The storm would kill him within the hour if he stayed outside. Ezra pushed back through the door, rifle raised. "Stay where you are!" Now the man looked up, and Ezra's blood turned to ice water. It was his father's face, unchanged by death or time. The same steel-grey eyes, the same weathered features, even the same scar across the left cheek from a Paiute arrow 20 years past. But something was wrong with those eyes. They held depths that hadn't been there before, like looking into a well at midnight. "That's no way to greet your old man," Samuel said, setting down his knife. "Especially after riding through hell's own storm to get here. You're dead." The words came out as a whisper. "I buried you myself outside Provo. The fever took you." Samuel smiled, but it was wrong somehow. Too wide, lasting too long. "Do I look dead to you, Ezra?" Ezra kept the rifle trained on his father's chest, though his hands shook from more than cold. "What are you?" "I'm your father, same as I ever was." Samuel gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit. You look like you've seen a ghost." The cabin was exactly as it had been when Ezra first glimpsed it through the storm. Rough-hewn logs, a stone fireplace, simple furniture. But now he noticed details that made his skin crawl. No fire burned in the hearth, yet the room was warm. No lamp was lit, yet he could see clearly. And there was a smell underneath it all, faint but persistent. The sweet, sick odor of things left too long in the ground. "I won't sit," Ezra said. "I won't pretend this is some family reunion." Stubborn as always. Samuel picked up his carving again, whittling at something Ezra couldn't quite make out. "You get that from your mother's side." The casual mention of his mother, his living mother, sent a spike of protective fury through Ezra. "Don't you speak of her. She mourned you proper. We all did." "Did you now?" The knife paused in its work. "Funny thing about mourning the dead, son. Sometimes we don't mourn quite as hard as we ought to. Sometimes we're almost relieved." Ezra's finger tightened on the trigger. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You know what it means." Samuel's eyes found his, and in them Ezra saw knowledge of things he'd tried to forget. "You think I don't know what you did? What you all did?" The rifle barrel wavered. Outside, the storm's howls seemed to grow more urgent, more desperate. "I don't know what you're talking about." The laudanum, Ezra. "In my water cup, the night I took the final turn." Samuel's voice was conversational, almost gentle, just enough to make sure the fever finished its work, just enough to make sure I didn't recover like Doc Peterson thought I might. Ezra's mouth went dry. "That's not." You were dying anyway. You were in pain. Was I? Samuel held up his carving, and Ezra saw it was a small wooden cross, the kind they used for grave markers. Or was I getting better, and that scared you all something fierce? The wind rattled the windows, and for a moment the lamp flames, flames that shouldn't exist, flickered. In that brief dimness, Ezra thought he saw something else in his father's face, something that explained the wrongness he'd felt from the first moment. The skin seemed loose in places, and there was a greyish tint beneath the weathered tan. "You can't be here," Ezra whispered. "The dead don't come back." Samuel smiled again, and this time Ezra saw that his teeth were black at the roots. Maybe they do when they've got unfinished business. Maybe they do when someone needs to answer for what they've done. The cross tumbled from Samuel's fingers, clattering on the table like bones. "Now," Samuel said, rising slowly from his chair, "let's talk about that night, shall we?" The wind hammered against the cabin walls with renewed fury, as if the storm itself conspired to trap Ezra inside with this impossibility. He pressed his back against the rough-hewn door, his breath coming in sharp bursts that clouded in the frigid air. The man who claimed to be his father sat motionless in the chair, those familiar blue eyes tracking every movement with an intensity that made Ezra's skin crawl. "You're frightened of me, boy." The voice carried the same gentle reproach it had when Ezra was 8 and afraid of thunder. "That cuts deeper than any grave ever could. Don't." The word escaped as barely more than a whisper. "Don't speak like him. Don't wear his face." A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. In the dancing light, the man's features seemed to waver between the beloved and the terrible. The same weathered hands that had taught Ezra to whittle, the same crooked smile that had greeted him each morning for 20 years of his life. Yet something fundamental was wrong, like looking at one's reflection in water disturbed by stones. "I know what you're thinking," the man said, rising slowly from the chair. Each movement was deliberate, careful, as if he were relearning how to inhabit his own flesh. "You buried me outside Nauvoo, you and your mother and that fool brother of yours, Samuel. You threw dirt on my pine box and wept like the world was ending." Ezra's throat constricted. Those details, Samuel's racking sobs, his mother's silent tears, cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks, the terrible hollow sound of soil striking wood, they were private griefs, known only to those who had stood graveside that bitter February morning. "How?" The question tore from his throat. "How do you know these things?" "Because I was there." The man stepped closer, and Ezra caught a scent that made his stomach lurch. Not decay, but something else entirely. Fresh earth, mountain pine, and underneath it all the copper tang of blood. Not in the box, you understand. That was just meat and bone, the shell I'd worn too long. But I was there, watching my family weep for something that was already walking free. "That's impossible. The fever took you. I held your hand when you—" Ezra's voice cracked. "When you died. I felt you leave. Death ain't the ending we've been taught to expect, son. Sometimes it's just a doorway to rooms we didn't know existed." The man gestured toward the storm-lashed window. "These mountains, this wilderness, it's older than our faith, older than our understanding. Out here, the rules we've lived by don't hold the same weight." Ezra forced himself to stand straighter, drawing on reserves of courage he'd cultivated during 3 years of hard travel and harder winters. "Prove it. Tell me something only he would know." A sad smile played across the familiar features. "You were 7 when you broke your mother's good china plate, the one with the blue flowers. You hid the pieces under the loose board in the barn and blamed the cat. I never said a word, but I swept up the fragments that night and buried them behind the house. You thought you'd gotten away with your first real lie." The memory hit like a physical blow. Ezra had never told another soul about that incident, had carried the guilt for years until it became just another small weight in the collection of childhood shames. "That don't mean anything," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Could be some desert demon, feeding on memories of the dead." "Could be." The man nodded agreeably. "But then again, Maybe you're standing before a miracle. Maybe the Lord has seen fit to undo what was done, to give us both another chance at the time we lost. The Lord doesn't work that way. How do you know? Have you plumbed the depths of his mysteries? Have you mapped the boundaries of his power? The man's eyes grew distant, as if seeing something beyond the cabin walls. I've walked in places you can't imagine, Ezra. I've seen wonders and horrors that would shatter your faith like glass. The God we worship is vast and terrible and strange, and his purposes are not always gentle. Outside, the wind's howl took on an almost human quality, rising and falling like voices raised in lamentation. Ezra found himself thinking of his mother, waiting for his return in their small cabin near the Green River. What would she say if he told her? How could he possibly explain that her husband might be alive, might be sitting in this God-forsaken place, wearing his own face like a mask? "What do you want?" Ezra asked finally. The man smiled, and for just a moment he looked exactly like the father Ezra remembered, tired, weathered, but filled with quiet love. "To go home," he said simply, "to see your mother again, to finish what was left undone when the fever claimed me." The fire popped and hissed, and in its light neither man cast a shadow. The wind had died to a whisper by the time Jeremiah stirred from his uneasy sleep. Grey morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, casting everything in muted tones that seemed to drain the color from the world itself. He sat up slowly, his neck stiff from sleeping against the rough stone of the fireplace, and immediately searched the shadows for his father. The chair sat empty. Relief flooded through him so suddenly that his hands shook. Perhaps it had been a fever dream, brought on by exhaustion and the bitter cold. Perhaps grief had finally claimed his sanity, just as his mother had warned it might. He rubbed his eyes and stood, wincing at the protest from his frozen joints. "Good morning, son." The voice came from behind him, calm and familiar. Jeremiah spun around to find his father standing in the doorway of what must have been the cabin's single bedroom, fully dressed despite having no possessions, no traveling pack, nothing but the clothes on his back. In the pale light, the resemblance was even more unsettling. Every line of his face, every silver hair at his temples, exactly as Jeremiah remembered from that final day when they'd closed the pine coffin. "You're not real," Jeremiah whispered, backing against the cold stones of the fireplace. "You're dead. I buried you myself." His father stepped into the main room, moving with that same measured gait Jeremiah remembered from childhood. "Did you now? Strange thing, memory. Sometimes it plays tricks on a man." He moved to the window and peered out at the white expanse beyond. "Storms passed. Road'll be clear soon enough." "I carried your coffin," Jeremiah said, his voice growing stronger. "I threw dirt on your grave. I said the words over your body." Words. His father turned from the window, and for a moment something flickered across his features. Something that wasn't quite right, like a mask slipping. Powerful things, words, but they don't always mean what folks think they mean. The fire had died to embers during the night, but the cabin felt warm despite the December cold outside. Too warm, Jeremiah realized. Unnaturally warm. His breath should have been misting in the air, but it wasn't. "What happened to you?" Jeremiah asked. "What are you?" His father smiled, and it was the same gentle expression that had comforted Jeremiah through childhood nightmares and adolescent fears. "I'm your father, son. Same as I always was. Same as I'll always be." "That's not an answer, isn't it?" His father moved to the crude wooden table and ran his fingers along its surface. Where he touched, the wood seemed to darken, as if stained by something unseen. "You always were too curious for your own good, Jeremiah. Even as a boy, always asking questions that didn't need asking." A memory surfaced unbidden. His father's final weeks. The way he'd grown distant and strange, muttering in languages that sounded older than English, older than anything Jeremiah had ever heard. The way he'd insisted on traveling alone to these mountains despite his illness, claiming he had business to finish. Business he'd never explained. "You came here before," Jeremiah said. "Before you died. You came to this cabin." Smart boy. His father's smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too white, too sharp. Always knew you'd figure it out eventually. What did you do here? Instead of answering, his father moved to a section of the wall where the logs were darkest with age and moisture. He pressed his palm against the wood, and something shifted. A hidden panel slid aside with a grinding sound, revealing a narrow opening barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Some choices echo longer than others, his father said. Some bargains got terms that extend beyond the grave. The opening exhaled a smell that made Jeremiah's stomach lurch. Not decay exactly, but something older and more fundamentally wrong. It was the smell of earth that had never seen sunlight, of things that moved in the deep places beneath the world. "I won't ask again," Jeremiah said, though his voice trembled. "What are you?" His father turned away from the hidden opening, and in the grey morning light, his face looked different. The features were the same, but they sat wrong somehow, like a photograph that had been subtly altered. The eyes were too bright, too knowing. "I'm what's left," he said simply, "and I'm what's needed." The panels slid shut with another grinding sound, but the smell lingered. Jeremiah found himself moving toward the door without conscious thought, his hand reaching for the latch. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to put distance between himself and whatever was wearing his father's face. "Don't," his father said quietly. "Not yet. We got talking to do first, about why you're really here, about what you're really looking for in these mountains." Jeremiah's hand froze on the latch. He hadn't told anyone his destination, hadn't spoken of the dreams that had driven him into the high country, despite the approaching storm. "How do you know about that?" His father's laugh was soft and terrible. "Son, I know everything." The wind howled like a wounded beast against the cabin walls, and Jeremiah found himself grateful for the distraction. It gave him reason to avoid looking directly at the man who claimed to be his father, the man who wore his father's face, spoke with his father's voice, yet sat breathing where only death should remain. "You always were too serious, boy," the figure said, settling into the wooden chair with an ease that made Jeremiah's stomach turn. Even as a child, carrying the weight of the world on those narrow shoulders. The familiarity of the words cut deeper than any blade. How many times had his father spoken those exact phrases during Jeremiah's youth in Nauvoo? How many evenings had they sat together while his father mended harnesses and dispensed gentle wisdom about the burdens of responsibility? "Stop," Jeremiah's voice cracked like kindling. "You're not him." "Ain't I?" The man leaned forward, firelight dancing across features that belonged to Thomas Whitmore, the same weathered hands, the same scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood accident involving a spooked horse. "Tell me, son, what convinced you I was dead? Did you see my body? Did you witness my final breath?" The questions struck like physical blows. Jeremiah's mind reeled back to that terrible winter 3 years past, when his father had ventured into these same mountains seeking stray cattle. The search party had found his horse, bridle torn and bloody, near a ravine. His father's coat, shredded and stained, had been discovered caught on brambles 50 yards downslope. The tracks of a massive bear, larger than any they'd seen before, had told the rest of the story. "We found enough," Jeremiah whispered. "The blood, the tracks. You were gone for 5 days in weather that would kill a man in hours. And yet, here I sit." The thing wearing his father's form spread its hands wide, warm and breathing. "Perhaps your faith in the impossible needs strengthening." "My faith?" Jeremiah's voice rose, edged with hysteria. "You speak to me of faith while wearing the face of the dead?" The cabin fell silent save for the storm's relentless assault. In that quiet, Jeremiah became aware of something else, an absence that chilled him more than the mountain wind. He realized he could hear his own breathing, rapid and panicked, but nothing from the figure across from him. No soft exhalations, no rustling of clothing with the rise and fall of a chest. The man's eyes, his father's eyes, tracked Jeremiah's growing awareness with something that might have been amusement. "You always were observant," he said. "Remember when you caught me sneaking extra molasses into the corn cakes? You couldn't have been more than 7, but you watched me with those sharp eyes and knew something wasn't right. The memory was accurate, painfully so, but now it felt tainted, corrupted by the lips that spoke it. "What are you?" Jeremiah's hand found the wooden cross hanging beneath his shirt, fingers gripping it tight enough to leave marks. "I'm your father, boy, same as I ever was." The figure's smile revealed teeth too white, too perfect for a man who should have been mouldering in an unmarked grave, though I suppose death changes a man in ways the living can't rightly understand. "The dead don't come back." Jeremiah clung to the certainty of his beliefs like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. Scripture tells us many things. The interruption was gentle but firm. It speaks of resurrections, of the dead rising, of miracles that defy earthly understanding. Are you so certain you know which laws govern this wilderness? Outside, something crashed against the cabin, a tree branch or perhaps something larger. The sound made Jeremiah jump, but his father, this thing, didn't even flinch. It simply continued watching him with that patient, predatory attention. "I buried you," Jeremiah said, though even as the words left his lips, he knew they weren't true. They'd buried an empty coffin, filled with stones and prayers and the desperate need for closure. The bishop had spoken words of comfort over disturbed earth that held nothing but their hopes for peace. "Did you now?" The question held no accusation, only curiosity. "Or did you bury your guilt, your shame at failing to save me?" The words found their mark with surgical precision. Jeremiah had replayed that day countless times. If he'd insisted on riding along, if he'd searched the western pastures first, if he'd been faster to organize the rescue party. The weight of those failures had crushed him for months after the funeral. "I should have been there," he whispered. "Yes," the figure agreed. "You should have." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Outside, the blizzard raged with renewed fury, sealing them together in this mountain tomb where the impossible sat breathing, or pretending to breathe, and spoke truths too terrible to bear. The wind had died to a whisper by the time Ezra forced himself to approach his father's still form. Each step across the cabin floor felt like walking through molasses, his boots heavy as lead. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, a sound that seemed to echo far too long in the oppressive silence. His father lay exactly as he had fallen, arms splayed at unnatural angles, face turned toward the dying fire. But there was no blood, no visible wound, nothing to explain the sudden collapse. Ezra knelt beside the body, his hands trembling as he reached out to check for breathing. The skin was warm. Ezra jerked his hand back as if burned, his heart hammering against his ribs. He forced himself to try again, pressing his palm against his father's chest. Nothing. No rise and fall, no heartbeat. Yet the flesh retained its warmth, supple and alive to the touch. "This ain't possible," he whispered, his voice cracking like a boy's. He rolled the body onto its back, studying his father's face in the firelight. The same weathered features, the same grey beard, the same scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood accident Ezra remembered hearing about countless times. Even in death, Jeremiah looked exactly as he had 3 years ago when they'd lowered him into that frozen ground outside Salt Lake City. Ezra's mind raced through possibilities, each more impossible than the last. A twin brother? His father had never mentioned siblings. Someone who merely resembled Jeremiah? The likeness was too perfect, down to the peculiar way his father's left ear had been notched by a bull's horn decades ago. He searched the cabin with renewed urgency, looking for anything that might explain what he'd stumbled into. The few personal effects yielded no answers. A well-worn Bible, some crude eating utensils, a leather pouch containing what looked like dried herbs. No letters, no documents, nothing with a name or explanation. As he rifled through a wooden crate near the far wall, his fingers closed around something unexpected. A small daguerreotype in a tarnished frame. His breath caught as he angled it toward the firelight. The image showed a group of men in formal dress, standing before what looked like a partially constructed building. And there, third from the left, stood his father. But the man beside him made Ezra's blood run cold. It was Jeremiah again, identical in every detail. Two of his fathers standing side by side, neither one showing the slightest difference from the other. The photograph slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. Behind him, something shifted. Ezra spun around to find his father sitting upright, head cocked at an unnatural angle, eyes fixed on him with an expression of mild curiosity. There was no transition, no gradual awakening, one moment dead, the next simply there, watching. "You found the picture," Jeremiah said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "I wondered when you might." Ezra stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the cabin wall. "You were dead. I checked. You weren't breathing." "Death is more complicated than most folks realize, son." Jeremiah climbed to his feet with fluid grace, showing no sign of the violent collapse from before, especially in a place like this. "What kind of place?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper. His father gestured vaguely at the walls around them. "Sacred ground, you might say, though not in any way the church would recognize." He began moving closer, each step deliberate and measured. "Some locations hold power, Ezra. Old power. The kind that existed long before any white man set foot in these mountains." Ezra pressed himself harder against the wall, feeling for his gun. His holster was empty. He'd forgotten removing it earlier, setting it aside when he'd settled in for what he'd thought would be a normal night's shelter. "You're not my father." Jeremiah paused, tilting his head with that same unnatural angle. "Now that's an interesting question, isn't it? I have his memories, his voice, his face. I know about the time you broke your arm falling from the apple tree when you were 7. I remember teaching you to shoot behind the barn. How proud I was when you finally hit that tin can on the fence post." The memories were accurate, perfectly detailed. Ezra felt his certainty wavering. "I know about the letter you never sent," Jeremiah continued. "The one where you tried to tell me about your doubts, about the church, about whether you truly believed everything Brother Brigham taught us." Ezra's mouth went dry. He'd written that letter the night before his father died, had burned it in shame without ever showing it to anyone. "How could you know that?" His father smiled, but there was something wrong with the expression, too wide, lasting too long. "Because I was there, son. I've been watching, waiting. This place has rules, and one of them is that nothing truly dies here, it just changes." Outside, the wind began to pick up again, howling around the cabin's walls like something alive and hungry. The wind had died to a whisper by dawn, but Ezekiel couldn't bring himself to leave the corner where he'd spent the night. His father moved about the cabin with that same deliberate efficiency he remembered from childhood, stoking the fire, checking the windows, organizing supplies that seemed to multiply in the shadows. "Storms passed," his father said without looking at him. "Road'll be clear enough by midday." Ezekiel's throat felt raw from the cold air he'd been breathing through the gaps in the cabin walls. "I buried you, Pa. In the cemetery behind the chapel. Brother Morrison said the words over your grave." His father's hands stilled on the coffee pot. For a moment, the only sound was the settling of logs in the fireplace. When he turned, his face wore an expression Ezekiel had never seen before, something between sorrow and resignation. "I know you did, son." The admission hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. He pressed his back harder against the wall, feeling the rough logs dig into his spine through his coat. "Then how are you here? How are you alive?" His father poured coffee into a tin cup, the liquid steaming black in the morning light. "That's a complicated question, with a complicated answer." Ezekiel watched his father's movements, searching for some tell, some sign that this was an elaborate deception. But every gesture was familiar, the way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right from an old injury, the careful precision with which he handled hot surfaces after burning his palm on a forge years ago. "The night before I died," his father continued, settling into the chair across from him, "I received a visitor. A man I'd met years before, during my time in California." The mention of California sent ice through Ezekiel's veins. His father had never spoken of those missing years, The time between leaving their family farm in Missouri and arriving in Utah territory with claims of religious conversion and a mysterious fortune that had funded their new life. What kind of visitor? His father sipped his coffee, and Ezekiel noticed his hands didn't shake despite the heat of the cup. The kind that offers bargains, the kind that collects debts. He looked up, and in the morning light his eyes seemed darker than Ezekiel remembered. "I made a deal once, son. A foolish deal born of desperation and grief." "What kind of deal?" "Your mother was dying. Consumption was eating her alive, and the doctors in Sacramento said there was nothing to be done." His father's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But there are other kinds of doctors in places like California. Men who practice older medicines." Ezekiel felt his world tilting again. His mother had died when he was 7, before the family's conversion, before their migration west. He'd always been told it was God's will that she'd passed peacefully in her sleep. "I found a man who promised he could save her. All it would cost me was a favor to be collected later." His father's laugh was bitter. "I was so young, so desperate. I thought I was clever, agreeing to such vague terms." "Did he save her?" "For a time. She lived another 5 years, long enough to see you grow from a boy into someone who could take care of himself. But the debt—" His father set down the cup with a sharp clink. "The debt came due eventually." Ezekiel's mind raced through memories, trying to reconcile this new information with everything he thought he knew about his family's history. "The night you died. The night I honored my bargain." His father stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "The terms were simple. When called upon, I would serve. My death was merely the beginning of that service." "Serve who? Serve how?" His father was quiet for so long that Ezekiel wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the cabin walls. "There are things in these mountains, son. Old things that were here long before the Ute, before the Spanish, before any human foot touched this ground. They hunger for warmth, for life, for the spark that animates flesh and blood." He turned from the window. "And they require maintenance, feeding, guidance." The coffee cup slipped from Ezekiel's numb fingers, clattering against the floor. "You're saying you're some kind of—" "Shepherd," his father finished. "I guide the lost to where they need to go. I ensure the hungry are fed. I maintain the balance that keeps certain things from wandering down into the valleys where good people live their lives." Outside, something howled in the distance. Not quite wolf, not quite human. His father tilted his head, listening with the attention of someone well-versed in translating such sounds. "And now," his father said, meeting Ezekiel's horrified gaze, "my time of service is ending. The debt transfers to blood." The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that pressed against Samuel's ears like the weight of snow itself. Through the cabin's single window, dawn revealed a world transformed. Drifts sculpted by wind into impossible shapes, trees bent and broken under white burden, the familiar landscape rendered alien and impassable. His father moved about the cabin with the same methodical precision Samuel remembered from childhood mornings. Coffee brewing, kindling arranged, boots set by the door to dry. The mundane rituals made everything worse somehow, as if normalcy itself had become a mockery. "Road won't be clear for days," Josiah said, not looking at his son. "Maybe weeks. Spring melt's the only thing that'll shift snow like that." Samuel sat rigid on the edge of the narrow cot, his Bible unopened in his lap. He'd tried to read through the night, seeking comfort in familiar verses, but the words seemed to writhe and shift before his eyes. Sleep had been impossible with his father's steady breathing just feet away, the sound of lungs that should have been rotting in Missouri earth. "You're afraid of me." It wasn't a question. Samuel's hands tightened on the leather binding. "I buried you. I put dirt on your coffin with my own hands." "I know." "Then explain it. Make me understand." The words came out sharper than intended, edged with 3 years of grief and guilt. "Because I've been carrying the weight of your death, thinking I failed you somehow, thinking if I'd stayed instead of going to find medicine, you'd have died too." Josiah's voice carried no emotion, flat as winter sky. Fever took half the camp. You did what needed doing, but you didn't die. Samuel stood abruptly, the Bible tumbling to the floor. You're here. You're alive. So where have you been? Why didn't you come home to Mother, to Elizabeth? Do you know what your death did to them? For the first time since Samuel's arrival, something flickered across his father's features. Pain, perhaps, or the memory of it. But it vanished so quickly, Samuel wondered if he'd imagined it. Some things can't be explained with words from that book. Josiah nodded toward the fallen Bible. Some truths are too large for faith to hold. Samuel retrieved the Bible, clutching it like an anchor. There's nothing too large for God's truth, nothing that can't be explained by His will. You think this is God's will? His father's laugh was bitter as frozen metal. You think the Almighty reached down and pulled me from my grave? I don't know what to think. That's why I need you to tell me. But Josiah had turned away, staring out at the endless white. There are places in these mountains where the snow never melts, valleys where the sun don't reach and the cold runs so deep it becomes something else, something alive. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing inward. Samuel watched his father's profile, noting details he'd missed in the shock of recognition. The skin was too pale, almost translucent. The eyes held no warmth, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. And underneath the familiar scent of tobacco and leather, something else lingered, something that made Samuel's stomach clench. The night I took fever, Josiah continued, his voice distant, I dreamed of such a place, dreamed I was walking through snow that sang like wind through bone. And there were others walking with me, men I'd known who'd died in these mountains, trappers, prospectors, travelers who'd lost their way, all of us moving towards something in the distance, something that called without sound. Samuel's mouth had gone dry. Delirium, the fever made you see things. Did it? Josiah turned back to him, and for a moment his eyes seemed to reflect light like an animal's. Then how do you explain my being here? How do you explain this? He rolled up his sleeve, revealing an arm that should have been flesh and blood. Instead, Samuel saw something that made his vision blur and his faith crack like ice under pressure. The skin moved wrong, shifting and flowing as if it were merely a covering for something else beneath, something that had never been human. Father? The word came out as a whisper. I came back because you were coming, could feel you in the storm, fighting toward this place. And I wanted to see my boy one more time before— He let the words trail off, rolling his sleeve back down with careful precision. Before what? But Josiah was already moving toward the door, lifting the heavy wooden bar with ease that seemed wrong for a man his age. Storms passed. Time to go. Go where? The snow's too deep. Not for us. Not anymore. His father's smile held no warmth, only hunger. There's someone waiting to meet you, Samuel. Someone who's been very patient. The door swung open, revealing the blinding white of morning snow and something else. Shapes moving in the drifts, figures that shouldn't exist but did, all turning toward the cabin with the same terrible patience that marked his father's face. The storm had intensified beyond anything Ezra had witnessed in his 28 years. Wind shrieked through the cabin's gaps like the damned crying out from hell itself, and snow piled against the windows until only darkness remained visible through the glass. But the true terror wasn't the blizzard. It was the man sitting across from him, whittling a piece of wood with hands that should have been bones and dust. You're thinking too hard, son, his father said without looking up from his carving. The knife moved in precise strokes, shaving curls that fell to the floor like pale moths. Always did think too much, even as a boy. Ezra's throat felt lined with sand. You died of consumption. I watched you waste away for months, Martha and I. We washed your body, wrapped you in canvas because we couldn't afford a proper shroud. Did you now? Thomas Blackwood's voice carried that familiar note of amusement that had once comforted Ezra through childhood nightmares. Now it chilled him to the marrow. Funny thing about dying, Ezra, sometimes it don't take the first time. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. In the shifting light, Thomas looked almost normal, the same weathered face, the same calloused hands, the same grey beard that had always smelled of tobacco and sage. But his eyes held depths that hadn't been there before, dark pools that seemed to reflect things that weren't in the room. "The others," Ezra whispered. "The family that lived here. What happened to them?" Thomas set down his whittling and looked directly at his son. When he smiled, his teeth seemed too white, too sharp. "The Merciers, fine folks. Henry was a trapper, came up here with his wife and 2 little ones to escape the world below. Thought they could make a life in the high country. Where are they?" "Oh, they're still here." Thomas gestured vaguely around the cabin. In a manner of speaking. Ezra's gaze swept the room with new horror. The carefully arranged furniture, the woman's shawl draped over a chair, the children's toys stacked neatly in the corner. It all suddenly felt wrong, like a stage set dressed by someone who had never actually lived a normal life. "You killed them." "Now, that's a harsh word." Thomas picked up his knife again, testing its edge against his thumb. A thin line of blood appeared, black in the firelight. "I prefer to say I gave them purpose. You see, Ezra, death changed me, opened doors in my mind that had been locked tight, showed me truths that the living ain't meant to understand." The wind howled louder, and something scratched against the roof, long, deliberate scrapes like claws on wood. Ezra looked up, but Thomas didn't seem to notice. "There are things in these mountains older than the Ute, older than the first white man to cross the divide. Things that sleep in the deep places, waiting for the right kind of invitation, the right kind of sacrifice. Father, please." The Merciers understood at the end, when I explained what needed to be done, how their deaths would serve a greater purpose. They went quiet-like, peaceful. Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. "Just like you will." Ezra lurched to his feet, knocking over his chair. The crash echoed through the cabin, but the sound seemed muffled, as if the storm was swallowing it. His hand instinctively went to the Colt at his hip, but something stayed his draw. This was his father, the man who had taught him to shoot, to track, to survive in the wilderness, the man who had sung him to sleep with hymns and stories of Joseph Smith's visions. "Sit down, son." Thomas's voice carried absolute authority, the same tone that had compelled obedience throughout Ezra's childhood. "We have much to discuss before dawn." Despite every instinct screaming at him to run, Ezra found himself sinking back into his chair. The fire seemed to dim, and the shadows pressed closer. Outside, the scratching on the roof grew more insistent, joined by other sounds, whispers in languages that predated human speech, the rustle of things moving through the storm that had never been alive in any conventional sense. "You see, the consumption didn't just take my life," Thomas continued, his knife resuming its steady rhythm against the wood. "It prepared me, hollowed me out so that other things could fill the empty spaces, ancient things, hungry things." The piece he was carving began to take shape in the firelight, a crude human figure with arms outstretched, as if in supplication or surrender. When Ezra looked closer, he could see that Thomas had carved his own face into the tiny wooden head, down to the smallest detail. "The Merciers were just the beginning," Thomas said softly. "Practice, you might say. But you, Ezra, your family, your death will mean so much more." The fire guttered lower, and in the growing darkness, Ezra began to see other shapes moving in the corners of the cabin, pale, translucent figures that might once have been human. The wind had died to an eerie whisper by the time Samuel forced himself to approach his father's still form. The lantern cast dancing shadows across Isaiah's face, making it appear as though he were merely sleeping fitfully rather than lying motionless on the cabin floor. Blood had pooled beneath his head where it struck the stone hearth, dark and glistening in the flickering light. Samuel knelt beside the body, his hands trembling as he reached for his father's wrist, no pulse. The skin was already growing cold, though whether from death or the mountain air seeping through the cabin's gaps, he couldn't say. He pressed his ear to Isaiah's chest, listening for any sign of breath, but heard only the settling of the cabin's timbers and his own ragged breathing. "Stay dead," Samuel whispered, the words feeling like blasphemy even as they left his lips. "Please, Just stay dead this time." He sat back on his heels, staring at the man who had raised him, beaten him, taught him scripture and the weight of sin in equal measure. The face was exactly as Samuel remembered from 3 years ago, not a day older, not a mark of age or decay. Even now, with blood matting his grey hair, Isaiah looked as though he might open his eyes and begin reciting psalms in that commanding voice that had shaped Samuel's childhood. The journal lay open beside the body, its pages fluttering slightly in the draught. Samuel picked it up with shaking hands, squinting at the faded ink in the lantern light. Most of the entries were illegible, water-stained and worn, but fragments remained clear enough to chill him to the bone. "The hunger grows stronger each time. Martha's blood sustained me through the first winter, but it weakens. Need fresh." Buried the prospector deep in the mine shaft. His screams echoed for hours before. "Samuel will come looking eventually. My boy always was persistent. When he finds me, perhaps." Samuel's stomach lurched, and he dropped the journal as though it had burst into flames. The implications crashed over him like an avalanche. His father, this thing wearing his father's face, had been living in these mountains for 3 years, surviving on human blood like some biblical demon. How many travelers had sought shelter in this cabin? How many had never made it home to their families? And Martha. Sweet Martha Henley, who had vanished during a supply run to the valley settlements 2 summers past. They'd found her horse wandering loose, assumed she'd been taken by wolves or fallen into a ravine. The search parties had combed the mountains for weeks before giving up hope. Samuel pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to shut out the image of Martha's final moments in this very cabin. Had she recognized Isaiah? Had she tried to reason with him, reminded him of his Christian duty? Or had she seen immediately that whatever sat before her was no longer the man she'd known? A sound outside made him freeze, the soft crunch of footsteps in snow. Samuel grabbed the lantern and rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness beyond the glass. The storm had cleared enough to reveal patches of starlit sky, and in that pale light he could make out a figure approaching the cabin. His heart hammered against his ribs as the figure drew closer. It was a woman, hunched against the cold, leading a horse through the drifts. She moved slowly, exhausted, probably drawn by the light from the cabin windows. A traveler seeking the same shelter Samuel had found, the same shelter that had claimed Martha Henley and God knew how many others. Samuel looked back at his father's body, then at the approaching woman. He could warn her, send her away into the night to find shelter elsewhere. But the nearest settlement was 20 miles through treacherous mountain passes, and the temperature was dropping fast. Without shelter, she would die before dawn. Yet if he let her in, if his father somehow returned again... The woman was close enough now that he could see her face, young, perhaps 20, with the pale complexion of someone unused to mountain travel. Her lips were blue with cold, and she moved with the jerky, unsteady gait of advancing hypothermia. Even as he watched, she stumbled and nearly fell, catching herself against her horse's neck. She would die out there. That was certain, but she might die in here too. Samuel made his choice. He unbarred the door and stepped out into the bitter air, his breath forming clouds in the starlight. "Ma'am," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am, you need to turn around, find shelter elsewhere." The woman looked up at him with eyes glazed by cold and exhaustion. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I can't go any further." Behind him, inside the cabin, Samuel heard the soft scrape of something moving across the wooden floor. The wind had died to a whisper by dawn, but the silence that followed felt more ominous than the storm's fury. Samuel stood at the cabin window, watching pale sunlight filter through the skeletal branches of the surrounding pines. Behind him, his father moved with that same unnatural fluidity, preparing what appeared to be breakfast from supplies that shouldn't have existed. "The snow's letting up," Samuel said, not turning around. His breath still fogged the glass despite the warmth radiating from the hearth. "I should be able to make it back to the settlement today." "Should you?" Jeremiah's voice carried an edge Samuel had never heard before, even in the old man's angriest moments. "After coming all this way to find me?" Samuel finally turned. His father stood by the crude wooden table, hands resting on what looked like a leather-bound journal. The book was thick, its pages yellowed and brittle, and Samuel was certain it hadn't been there moments before. "I didn't come here to find you, Pa. I came here to escape the storm. You're supposed to be dead." Jeremiah smiled, and in the morning light, Samuel could see that his teeth were too white, too perfect. The father, he remembered, had lost several teeth to age and hard living. "Death is just another kind of storm, son. Sometimes a man finds shelter from it." "What kind of shelter?" Instead of answering, Jeremiah opened the journal. The pages rustled with a sound like autumn leaves, or perhaps like something much drier. "Do you remember why we came west, Samuel? Your mother and I, with you just a babe in arms? For the gospel. To build Zion in the wilderness." That's what I told myself. Jeremiah's finger traced lines of text Samuel couldn't quite make out from across the room. "But the truth is, I was running, just like you're running now." Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward the colt at his hip. "Running from what?" "From what I'd done, from what I'd learned." Jeremiah looked up from the journal, and his eyes seemed deeper than they should be, as if Samuel was staring into wells that had no bottom. "There are older gospels than ours, boy, older covenants. The Ute knew about this place long before any white man set foot in these mountains. They called it a thin place, where the wall between worlds grows gossamer fine." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop despite the crackling fire. Samuel could see his breath again, and something cold crawled up his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "That's Indian superstition, Pa." "Is it?" Jeremiah closed the journal with a soft thump that echoed louder than it should have. "Then explain how I'm standing here. Explain how this cabin appeared exactly when you needed it. Explain how you found the one place in all these mountains where the dead can bargain their way back." Samuel's hand closed around the colt's grip. "What did you bargain?" "Nothing that was mine to give." Jeremiah's smile widened, and Samuel realized with horror that his father's shadow on the wall behind him was moving independently, gesturing with hands that ended in claws. "But everything that was yours to lose." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind. Rebecca's face when he'd left her standing in the snow, little Mary's tears, the disappointment in Elder Morrison's eyes. Every choice that had led him here suddenly felt inevitable, as if invisible strings had been pulling him toward this moment for years. "You did this," Samuel whispered. "You've been calling me here." "Every man must face his inheritance, Samuel. I faced mine when I first found this place 20 years ago, when I learned what the mountain demanded in exchange for its gifts." Jeremiah stepped around the table, moving with that fluid, unnatural grace. "I thought I could resist. I thought faith would be enough. But faith is just another word for fear dressed up in Sunday clothes." Samuel drew the colt in one smooth motion, but his father didn't even flinch. "Iron can't hurt me now, boy. I'm beyond such concerns." "Maybe, but I'm not shooting you." Samuel turned the gun toward himself, pressing the barrel against his temple. "Whatever game you're playing ends here. Whatever you bargained away, I won't be part of it." For the first time since Samuel had entered the cabin, genuine emotion flickered across Jeremiah's face. Surprise, perhaps even fear. "You always were too much like your mother," Jeremiah said softly. "Too willing to sacrifice yourself for others. She's the one who taught me about sacrifice. Real sacrifice, not whatever twisted version you've embraced." "Samuel, wait." But Samuel had already begun to squeeze the trigger when the journal on the table burst into flames, filling the cabin with screams that sounded like wind through empty graves. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since nightfall, and Ezekiel could feel the cold seeping through the cabin's log walls like icy fingers probing for weakness. He sat hunched over his father's journal, squinting at the faded ink by candlelight, trying to make sense of the increasingly erratic entries that chronicled Joshua's final days in these mountains. Day 47. The voices grow stronger when the wind picks up. Mary's voice clearest of all, calling me deeper into the peaks. She knows I'm here. Day 51. Found bones today. Human. Scattered in a pattern that ain't natural. Something's been feeding, but not like any animal I know. Day 58. They showed themselves last night. The ones who came before, still wearing their pioneer clothes, still carrying their rifles, still walking, though their flesh hangs like wet rags. Ezekiel's hands trembled as he turned the brittle page. Outside, the blizzard howled with renewed fury, but underneath that familiar sound, he could swear he heard something else. Footsteps, crunching through snow, circling the cabin with deliberate patience. Day 62. I understand now why Mary led me here. This place is a threshold, a crossing between what is and what should not be. The dead don't rest in these mountains. They wait, they hunger, and now I'm one of them. Day 63. If Ezekiel comes looking for me, he must not find this place. But if he does, if he reads these words, he needs to know the truth about what happened to our family. Mary didn't die in childbirth. The thing that came out of her wasn't our child. The candle flame flickered violently, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. Ezekiel looked up from the journal, his breath forming small clouds in the rapidly cooling air. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, though he couldn't remember it being so low just moments before. "Pa?" he called out softly, but received no answer. He returned to the journal with growing dread, his father's handwriting becoming increasingly wild and desperate in the final entries. Day 65. It found me tonight, my son, my beautiful boy who never drew breath, who came into this world wrong and hungry. Mary tried to warn me before she died, tried to tell me it wasn't natural, but I wouldn't listen. I buried them both, or thought I did. But burial doesn't mean rest, not here. Day 67. The thing wearing my son's face visited again. It's grown larger, more confident. It speaks now, calls me Papa in a voice like grinding stone. Says it's lonely in the darkness beneath the snow. Says it wants to play. Day 71. I see them all now, walking through the trees. Mary with her throat torn open, carrying something swaddled in bloody cloth. The other families who came through these mountains and never made it out. Children who died of cold and hunger, parents who succumbed to madness and despair, all of them bound to this cursed place, all of them hunting. A board creaked overhead, followed by the distinct sound of something heavy moving across the loft floor. Ezekiel's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He had checked the loft when he first arrived. Nothing had been up there but dust and mouse droppings. Day 75, last entry. It's taken my body now, the hunger, can feel myself changing, becoming like them, but part of me remains, enough to leave this warning. The thing that calls itself my son controls them all now, feeds on their pain and loneliness, growing stronger with each soul it claims. If you're reading this, Ezekiel, run. Don't try to save me. Don't try to understand. Just run and pray you make it to sunrise. The dead hunt in darkness, but dawn weakens them. Maybe enough for you to escape what I could not. The footsteps above had stopped, but now Ezekiel could hear something else. A soft scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. It was coming from the walls themselves, moving in a slow circle around the cabin's perimeter. He closed the journal with shaking hands and reached for his rifle, though he suspected bullets would prove useless against whatever was toying with him. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, joined by a low humming that might have been a lullaby, if it didn't sound so hungry and wrong. Through the frosted window, he glimpsed movement in the swirling snow, pale shapes drifting between the trees, too tall and angular to be human, yet wearing the tattered remnants of pioneer clothing. They moved with purpose, drawing closer to the cabin with each pass. And then, cutting through the wind and scratching and his own labored breathing, came a sound that nearly stopped his heart entirely. A child's voice, high and sweet and impossibly clear, calling out from somewhere in the storm. "Papa, Papa, where are you? I'm so cold, Papa. Won't you come play with me?" The wind had died to a whisper, but Samuel's blood still roared in his ears as he pressed himself against the cold stone wall of the mine shaft. The darkness beyond stretched like a hungry mouth, and somewhere in its depths, footsteps echoed with the measured pace of a man who had all eternity to hunt. "Samuel!" His father's voice drifted from the tunnels, distorted by rock and distance until it sounded like something speaking through water. "You cannot hide from what you are." The lantern in Samuel's trembling hand cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flame. He had followed the maps deeper into the mountain than any living soul should venture, past chambers filled with bones that weren't quite human and symbols carved into living rock that hurt to look upon directly. The truth lay somewhere ahead in the darkness, but behind him came something wearing his father's face and speaking with his father's voice, something that knew secrets no dead man should remember. A sound like grinding stone echoed through the shaft, and Samuel realized with growing horror that his father was no longer walking. Something was dragging itself through the tunnels, pulling its weight across the rough floor with fingernails that scraped against rock like chalk on slate. The steady rhythm grew closer, patient and inexorable as a heartbeat counting down to judgment. Samuel forced himself to move deeper into the mine, following a passage that sloped downward into the mountain's heart. The air grew thick and warm, carrying scents that belonged to no earthly place. Copper and sulfur and something sweetly rotting that made his stomach clench. The walls here bore more of those terrible symbols, and they seemed to pulse with their own faint luminescence, as if lit from within by some hellish fire. The passage opened into a vast chamber, and Samuel's lantern could not penetrate its furthest reaches. But what he could see made him wish for blindness. The floor was carpeted with bones, human bones arranged in careful patterns that spiraled inward toward a raised dais of black stone. Upon that altar lay something that might once have been a man, but death and time and things beyond both had worked their changes upon it. The mummified corpse wore the remnants of a Mormon temple garment, and around its neck hung a familiar silver watch. Samuel's grandfather, Ezekiel Whitmore, the man who had first come to these mountains seeking refuge from religious persecution, and found something far worse than the mobs that had driven him west. "Now you understand." The voice came from directly behind him, and Samuel spun to find his father standing at the chamber's entrance. But this was not the shambling thing that had pursued him through the tunnels. This was his father, as he remembered him, tall and proud, with eyes full of terrible knowledge. 3 generations of Whitmores have served as guardians of this place. 3 generations have died to keep its secrets buried. Samuel's hand found the pistol at his belt, though he knew bullets were useless against what stood before him. "You're not my father. My father is dead. I buried him myself." "Death is not the end, Samuel. It is merely a change of service." His father gestured toward the altar where Ezekiel's remains lay in state. "Your grandfather learned that when he first disturbed what sleeps beneath this mountain. The compact he made ensured our family's survival, but it demanded payment in blood and years and willing sacrifice." The truth crashed over Samuel like an avalanche, burying his last hopes beneath its weight. The plague that took you was no plague at all, but a calling home. When one guardian falls, another must take his place. I served my time as your grandfather served his, and now that duty passes to you. His father's eyes reflected the lantern light like a wolf's, empty of everything Samuel had once loved. "The people of these valleys sleep safe in their beds because we stand watch over what must never wake, because we pay the price they cannot imagine." Samuel raised the pistol with hands that shook like leaves in a gale. "I won't become like you. I won't serve whatever evil thing lurks in this place." "Evil?" His father laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the bone-filled chamber. "You think this is about good and evil? This is about survival, boy, about keeping the old powers sleeping until the world ends and takes them with it. Your wife, your children. They live only because someone stands between them and the darkness that would devour them. From somewhere far below came a sound like settling stone, but Samuel knew better. Something vast stirred in the depths, disturbed by their presence, by the breaking of long-held silences. The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, and the bones beneath their feet began to vibrate with sympathetic resonance. "Choose quickly, Samuel," his father whispered. "Take up the burden willingly, or let the mountain claim what it will." The wind had died to a whisper, but the silence that followed felt more ominous than the howling storm. Ezra pressed his back against the cabin door, his father's words echoing in his mind like a curse he couldn't shake. The thing that wore his father's face stood in the center of the room, head tilted as if listening to something only it could hear. "The others are stirring," it said, voice carrying that familiar cadence that made Ezra's chest ache with longing and revulsion in equal measure. "They've been waiting so long in the cold earth, but the barriers are weakening now." Ezra's grip tightened on the iron poker. "What barriers?" A smile played at the corners of his father's mouth, the same lopsided grin Ezra remembered from childhood, when Joshua Whitmore thought he was being particularly clever. "The prayers, boy, the blessed ground, the sacred words your people carved into every stone and tree for miles. Did you think they were just decoration?" The revelation hit Ezra like a physical blow. The strange symbols he'd seen carved into trees during his journey, the peculiar markers at crossroads, the way Mormon settlements seemed to follow specific patterns. It hadn't been random. It had been intentional, protective. "The church knew," he whispered. "Some of them suspected. Your grandfather certainly did, God rest his stubborn soul." The thing wearing his father's face moved to the window, peering out into the white darkness. He was the one who insisted on those particular burial rites: salt in the grave dirt, iron nails in the coffin, prayers spoken in the old tongue he learned from that Welsh woman in Nauvoo. Ezra remembered his grandfather's funeral, the unusual ceremony that had puzzled him as a boy. The excessive ritual, the strange words, the way the elders had seemed almost fearful rather than merely sorrowful. "But you found a way around it." "I found a crack." His father turned back to him, and for a moment the illusion wavered. Something else looked out from behind those familiar eyes, something vast and hungry and utterly inhuman. 3 years of clawing at the walls between worlds, 3 years of following your voice when you called out to me in your grief. You made quite the beacon, son. The guilt crashed over Ezra like an avalanche. All those nights he'd knelt beside his father's grave, pouring out his heart, begging for guidance, for forgiveness, for one more chance to make things right. He'd been so desperate to bridge the gap death had carved between them that he'd never considered what might be listening on the other side. "The night you decided to come up this mountain," his father continued, "the night you finally let go of your anger at me, that's when the crack became a doorway. Your forgiveness was the key I needed." "Stop." Ezra's voice cracked. "You're not him. You're just wearing his face." "Am I?" The thing stepped closer, and Ezra could smell that strange mixture of earth and decay beneath the familiar scent of pipe tobacco. "I have his memories, his voice. His love for you burns in me like a flame. When I look at you, I feel everything he felt. The pride when you took your first steps. The fear when you nearly drowned in Mill Creek. The shame when he realized he was failing you as a father." Tears blurred Ezra's vision. "He didn't fail me, didn't he? You've been carrying his mistakes like stones in your pockets for 3 years, the drinking, the gambling debts, the night he struck your mother and she never looked at him the same way again, the morning he chose the whiskey bottle over your baptism." Each word was a knife twist, perfectly aimed at wounds that had never properly healed. This thing knew exactly how to hurt him because it knew exactly how his father would have hurt him. "I can take all that pain away," his father's voice promised. "The guilt, the anger, the crushing weight of trying to be better than the man who raised you. All you have to do is let me stay." Outside, something howled in the distance, not wind, not wolf, but something else entirely. The sound was answered by another cry, then another, until the mountain seemed alive with unnatural voices. "They're coming," his father said with satisfaction. "My brothers and sisters who've been sleeping in the deep places, the first storm in a generation strong enough to crack the old protections. Soon this whole territory will remember what it was like before your people came with their prayers and their blessed salt." Ezra raised the poker with shaking hands. "I won't let you." His father's expression shifted to one of gentle disappointment. "You still don't understand, do you? I'm not asking for your permission, son. I'm asking for your company. Walk with me into the dark and we can be together forever. Fight me and I'll simply wear your face instead." The howling grew closer. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that pressed against Ezra's ears like cotton. Through the frost-etched windows, dawn light filtered pale and cold, casting everything in shades of bone and shadow. The cabin felt smaller now, suffocating, as if the walls had drawn closer during the night. His father sat motionless in the same chair, staring into the dead embers of the fire. The sight of him in daylight was somehow worse than in the flickering warmth of flame. Every detail was sharp, cruel in its clarity. The familiar weathered hands, the scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident Ezra remembered hearing about, the way he held his shoulders slightly hunched from years of hard labor. But his eyes. Dear God, his eyes were wrong. They held no warmth, no recognition of the son who had wept over his grave. They were the eyes of something wearing his father's face, like an ill-fitting coat. "The storm's past, Pa," Ezra said quietly, testing the waters of this nightmare. "We should be able to leave soon." The thing that wore Silas Hawthorne's face turned toward him with mechanical precision. When it spoke, even the voice was perfect. The same gravelly tone, the slight rasp from years of breathing desert dust. "Leave? But you just arrived, boy. We have so much catching up to do." A chill ran down Ezra's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. His father had never called him boy with such emptiness. Even during their worst arguments, there had always been something beneath the words: love, disappointment, anger, but something human. This thing felt hollow. "Tell me about the funeral," it continued, tilting its head in a gesture that was almost right but somehow fundamentally wrong. "Did they say nice things? Did you cry?" Ezra's mouth went dry. "Pa, what happened to you? How are you here?" "I asked you a question, Ezra." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Did you cry when they put me in the ground?" The words came unbidden from some deep place of grief he'd tried to bury. Yes, I cried. I cried because I never got to tell you I was sorry. Sorry for leaving, sorry for the things I said, sorry. The thing wearing his father's face smiled, and it was all wrong. Too wide, too knowing, such a small word for such large failures. Ezra felt his composure cracking. "What are you?" "I'm your father, boy. The father you killed with your selfishness and pride. You died of consumption." The doctor said, "The doctor." It laughed, and the sound was like wind through a graveyard. "Consumption," he said. "But we both know the truth, don't we? It was a broken heart that killed old Silas Hawthorne. Broken by a son who chose the world over family, who turned his back on everything that mattered." Ezra staggered backward, bumping into the table. No, that's not. You were sick. You were already sick when I left." "Was I?" It rose from the chair with fluid grace, too smooth for an old man who had been stiff with arthritis. "Or did the sickness start the day you walked out that door? The day you chose your pride over your father's love?" The cabin felt like a trap now, the walls pressing in, the air growing thick and hard to breathe. Ezra's hand found the door handle behind him, but it wouldn't turn. The metal was so cold it burned his palm. "Going somewhere, son?" The thing stepped closer, and Ezra could see now that no breath misted from its lips despite the frigid air. "But we're just getting reacquainted. I've been so lonely, Ezra, so very lonely in that cold, dark place you put me. I didn't put you anywhere. You died. I came as soon as I got word, but you were already dead." "Yes." It was close now, close enough that Ezra should have felt body heat, should have smelled the familiar scent of pipe tobacco and honest sweat. Instead, there was only the smell of turned earth and something else, something sweet and rotten. But death isn't the end, is it? Not when there are debts to be paid, not when there are sins to be answered for. Ezra pressed himself against the door, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of breakdown, some guilt-induced hallucination brought on by exhaustion and grief and the isolation of the mountains. But the thing wearing his father's face reached out with one weathered hand, and when it touched Ezra's cheek, the flesh was cold as grave dirt. "Don't you want to make it right, son?" it whispered, and its voice was soft now, almost kind, almost like the father he remembered. "Don't you want to join me? We could be together again. Forever." The hand on his cheek was growing colder, and Ezra felt something vital beginning to drain from him, pulled down into that icy touch. His vision blurred, his knees weakened, and somewhere in the growing darkness he heard his father's voice, his real father's voice, calling his name. But it was coming from very far away. The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls like the voices of the damned, but Samuel barely heard it now. His father sat motionless in the chair, that terrible smile frozen on his lips while the shadows danced around them in the firelight. The journal lay open between them, its pages fluttering despite the stillness of the air inside. "You always were too curious for your own good, boy," his father said, though his mouth didn't move. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Just like your mother." Samuel's grip tightened on the iron poker. "Don't you speak of her. She knew, you know, about what I really was, what I'd become after that first winter in these mountains." The thing wearing his father's face tilted its head. "Why do you think she never came looking for me when I disappeared for weeks at a time?" The memories came flooding back unbidden. His mother's hollow eyes during those long absences, the way she'd clutch her Bible and whisper prayers when the wind picked up, how she'd bar the door and windows whenever his father returned from his hunting trips, as if she feared something might follow him home. "She was protecting us," Samuel whispered. "She was protecting you from me." His father's form began to shift and blur at the edges, but she couldn't protect herself forever. Samuel's blood turned to ice. She died of fever. Did she? The question hung in the air like smoke. Or did I finally grow too hungry to resist what was right there in my own home? The poker trembled in Samuel's hands. Outside, something scratched at the walls, long, deliberate scrapes that moved in a circle around the cabin. More of them were coming. He could feel their presence pressing against the thin barrier of wood and stone that separated him from the storm. "The journal speaks of a way to end this," Samuel said, his voice steadier than he felt. "A way to send you back." His father's laughter was like breaking glass. "End it? Boy, you still don't understand. There is no ending this. There's only becoming." Samuel glanced down at the open pages. The text seemed to writhe in the firelight, but he could make out enough of the faded words to understand. The ritual required blood, the blood of the one who had awakened the thing, his blood. "The Wendigo feeds on more than flesh," his father continued, rising from the chair with movements that defied the laws of nature. "It feeds on souls, on the bonds between people. Every person it touches becomes part of it." The scratching outside grew louder, more insistent. Samuel backed toward the far wall, keeping the poker raised between them. "I felt you the moment you entered these mountains," his father said, moving closer. "Felt the connection between us calling me back. You see, Samuel, you didn't just find me here by accident. You called me here. That's not true, isn't it? Why else would you come to these particular mountains? Why else would the storm drive you to this exact cabin?" His father's face was changing now, becoming something gaunt and terrible. "You wanted to find me. Some part of you always knew I wasn't really dead." Samuel's back hit the wall. Through a crack in the boards, he could see pale shapes moving in the swirling snow. Eyes gleamed in the darkness beyond the firelight. "The blood calls to blood," his father whispered. now close enough that Samuel could smell the rot on his breath. "And when you join us, we'll go back down the mountain together, back to that nice little settlement where your wife and children are waiting." The mention of his family sent a surge of desperate strength through Samuel's limbs. He swung the poker in a wide arc, but it passed harmlessly through his father's form. The thing laughed and solidified just long enough to rake claws across Samuel's chest, shredding his coat and the flesh beneath. Samuel stumbled but stayed on his feet. Blood soaked through his shirt, and he could feel the cold air against the wounds. But the pain cleared his head, focused his thoughts on what needed to be done. The journal's pages were still turning in the wind that shouldn't exist. Samuel lunged for it, his father's claws missing him by inches. His bloody fingers found the passage he needed, the words becoming clear as his blood dripped onto the ancient paper. "Iron and fire," he read aloud. "Salt and sacred words." His father hissed and recoiled. Outside, the scratching stopped. Samuel grabbed the salt from his pack with his free hand, scattering it in a circle around himself while clutching the poker. The iron felt warm against his palm, and he realized it was growing hot, heated not by the fire but by something else entirely. "You cannot unmake what you have made," his father snarled. But there was something different in his voice now. Something that might have been fear. Samuel began to recite the words from the journal, his voice growing stronger with each syllable. The wind howled through the cabin's broken windows as Samuel pressed his back against the door, his father's inhuman shriek still echoing in his ears. The blessed silver cross burned hot against his palm, its light casting dancing shadows across the blood-stained walls. Outside, something heavy struck the cabin's exterior with enough force to rattle the entire structure. "You cannot hide from what you've done, boy." The voice that came through the storm was his father's, yet distorted, layered with harmonics that no human throat could produce. 3 years I've waited in the cold earth, feeling every worm, every root that pierced my flesh. 3 years of calling your name." Samuel's breath came in ragged gasps. The creature wearing his father's face had retreated when confronted with the cross, but he could feel its presence circling the cabin like a predator. Through the gaps in the shutters, he caught glimpses of movement, too quick, too fluid to be natural. Thunder cracked overhead, though no storm should sound like that in a blizzard. Samuel realized it wasn't thunder at all, but something vast stirring beneath the mountain. The ground trembled, and dust rained from the cabin's rafters. "The mine," he whispered, understanding flooding through him. "Dear God, the mine." His father's journal lay scattered across the floor where the creature had torn through it. Samuel gathered the pages with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the faded ink by the cross's silver light. The final entries spoke of dreams, of voices calling from deep underground, of something ancient that had been disturbed when they'd blasted the new shaft. Day 47. The men refused to go deeper. They speak of whispers in the dark, of shapes moving in the tunnels where no man walks. I fear we have awakened something that should have remained sleeping. Day 51. Lost 3 more today. Found their bodies arranged in patterns I dare not describe. The symbols carved into the rock face. They match those in grandmother's forbidden books. May the Lord forgive me. I know what we've unleashed. Day 54. It speaks to me now, in voices of the dead, promises of wealth, of power, of reunion with those I've lost. Sarah's voice is among them. She calls to me from the depths. I must resist, but oh, how I long to hear her sing again. The final entry was written in a different hand, shaky, desperate. They took father into the deep places. We sealed the mine, used every blessing we knew, but it was too late. The thing that came back, it wore his face, spoke with his voice, but its eyes held the hunger of the pit. We did what had to be done. May God forgive us all. E. Thorne. Samuel's hands trembled as he lowered the journal. Ezekiel Thorne, his father's mining partner, the man who'd helped bury what they'd thought was his father's body. But if that thing in the mine had been something else, something that had consumed his father's essence and worn his flesh like a garment, then what lay in the family plot back in Salt Lake? A sound like breaking glass drew his attention to the back wall. Frost spread across the wooden planks in unnatural patterns, forming symbols that hurt to look at directly. The temperature in the cabin plummeted until his breath came out in white puffs. "I know you're reading, Samuel." The voice came from directly behind the frosted wall now. "I know you understand what your dear old father discovered down in the dark. The things that live in the spaces between spaces, feeding on memory and flesh." The wall began to bow inward as something pressed against it from outside. The ancient wood groaned under impossible pressure. "He was so easy to take," the voice continued, almost conversational. "Already half mad with grief for your mother, already hearing voices in the tunnels. When I offered to bring her back, to make him whole again, he practically opened his arms to me." Samuel clutched the cross tighter, feeling its silver grow almost too hot to hold. The creature was lying. It had to be. His father had been a strong man, faithful and resolute. Yet the journal entries painted a different picture, one of a man consumed by loss and desperate enough to bargain with things that should not be. The wall splintered, and through the gap, Samuel saw an eye that reflected light like a cat's, but wrong. Too many colors, too deep, as if looking into a well that had no bottom. "But you, my boy," the thing whispered, its voice now coming from everywhere at once. "You're going to help me finish what he started. You're going to open the mine again, break the seals your coward friends put in place. And in return, I'll let you see your real father one last time before I wear his face forever." The cabin shuddered as something massive moved beneath them. In the distance, Samuel could hear the sound of stone grinding against stone, of earth splitting open. The mine was awakening, and with it, everything that had been buried in its depths. The cabin groaned against the wind as Samuel pressed his back against the splintered door, his father's words echoing in the howling darkness beyond. The blizzard had returned with vengeance, as if the mountain itself sought to bury what had transpired here. "You cannot run from what you are, my son." The voice carried impossibly through the storm, neither fully human nor entirely other. Samuel's hands trembled as he fumbled for his saddlebags, his fingers closing around the worn leather journal he'd carried since leaving Nauvoo. Inside lay the truth he'd tried so desperately to forget. Sketches of symbols carved into trees, accounts of livestock found drained and pale, and his own careful documentation of the thing that had stalked their wagon train 3 winters past, the thing that wore his father's face. A scraping sound traveled along the cabin's exterior wall, slow and deliberate. Samuel's breath misted in the frigid air as he opened the journal with shaking hands. The pages fell open to his final entry before burying what he'd believed was his father's body. The infection spreads through blood and breath alike. Those touched by it maintain their memories, their faces, their voices, but something else looks out through their eyes. Brother Kimball was right to burn the bodies, though we told the others it was cholera. Some hungers are older than sin itself, and twice as patient. The scraping stopped directly outside the door. "I know you're reading about me, Samuel, about what we found in those caves, about what found us." His father's voice had grown closer, more intimate. "You buried me incomplete. Do you understand what that means?" Samuel's throat constricted as memories flooded back, the desperate flight through mountain passes, his father growing weaker each day, the strange wounds that wouldn't heal, the way his father's eyes had changed in those final hours, becoming something vast and hungry. "You took my heart," the voice continued, almost gentle now. "Cut it out and burned it, just as Kimball taught you. But the mind, Samuel, the mind remembers everything. Every meal we shared, every prayer we spoke, every time you wept against my shoulder as a child." The wind died suddenly, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against Samuel's eardrums. In that quiet, he heard his father's breathing through the wooden walls, too slow, too deep, like air moving through a bellows. "I've been waiting in the spaces between death and hunger, learning patience from the mountain itself. Do you know what 3 years teaches a thing like me? It teaches appreciation for family, for blood that calls to blood." Samuel closed his eyes and whispered the words Brother Kimball had taught him. the ones that had failed to work completely before. By the power of the priesthood I bear, I command you to depart from this place and trouble the living no more. Laughter answered him, rich and familiar and wrong. Oh, my boy, I'm not some wandering spirit you can banish with words. I'm something older, something that was already ancient when your God was young. I'm hunger given form, and you are my greatest work. The door shuddered as something massive struck it from outside. See, Samuel, when you buried me incomplete, you didn't just fail to put me to rest, you created something new, something that remembers being human but has learned to be so much more, and now I'm going to teach you the same lessons. Samuel fumbled for his rifle, knowing bullets would be useless but needing the comfort of weight in his hands. The journal slipped from his lap, pages fluttering open to reveal his father's face, sketched in careful detail, but with eyes that held too much depth, too much darkness. I followed your scent through 3 territories, my son, through towns where children began disappearing after I passed, through homesteads where families welcomed a weary traveler only to wake changed, if they woke at all. I've been building something beautiful in your absence, a congregation of the transformed, all of them eager to meet the one who taught me incompleteness. The cabin's single window exploded inward as a shape too large to be human thrust itself through the opening. Samuel caught a glimpse of his father's face, stretched over something that had learned to walk upright, but had forgotten how to be bound by human limitations. The storm will end by morning, his father said, straightening to his full impossible height. And when it does, we'll walk down from this mountain together. There are settlements in the valley below, full of faithful families who'll welcome us with open arms, who'll never suspect that salvation and damnation can wear the same beloved face. Samuel raised his rifle with steady hands, no longer the frightened son who'd fled into the blizzard. He'd learned something about incompleteness too, how to embrace it, how to use it. Then I reckon, he said quietly, it's time I finished what I should have done 3 years ago. The thing that had been his father smiled with too many teeth and stepped forward into the firelight.